Hi there, folks. Before we get this episode started, we just want to warn our listeners that this episode is going to deal with some mildly adult themes, and it might also veer near topics that some of you might find controversial. We're not going to do anything that warrants an explicit tag, don't worry. But we still want to warn you that there might be some mildly suggestive adult themes in this episode, and if you're worried about that, you might want to skip this one. This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. Amazon. We here at the Word of the Week love a good origin story. After all, at the heart of every hero's story, there lies an origin story. As geeks, we're no strangers to such things. Loki was secretly a frost giant, and Thor gained his incredible powers through the magic of a romantic comedy. Batman's parents were murdered by Jack Nicholson before he got turned into the Joker, and then Adam West was trained by ninja Liam Neeson. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were bred by Shredder in a lab to help provide the cure to an ancient Japanese biological weapon. Those sound familiar, right? See, the thing is, geeks love to retell the same stories over and over again. But we, can never resist the urge to make their own little tweaks and changes. And that has been true since time immemorial. Origin stories change over time. They change with every new telling. And gradually, the original origin story gets lost, assuming it was ever really known in the first place. And it isn't just we geeks who do that. In fact, this is just one of the things that geeks have in common with Greeks. That and crazily inexplicable fandoms. This episode involves a pair of origin stories. The origin story for this episode is that we were originally going to mention this stuff as a throwaway remark in our episode about the solstice, or in our episode about typhoons. But they didn't fit there. So we were going to slot them into the recent Lost episode. But the mess of myths and legends and secrets that lay under that had to be disentangled to get to the true origin stories, and eventually warranted an entire episode by themselves. So this episode, like the topics we're going to discuss, is something of a lost and found episode. And it picks up where our Lost episode left off. You'll recall that we were telling the story of how Perseus killed Medusa the Gorgon, and how a clergyman writing an encyclopedia thought that story was a load of magical cow poop and said so in an entry about magical cows. And in that same entry, the one that created, or at least named, the metallic bull monster known as the Gorgon in D&D circles, he also mentioned that the story about Perseus killing Medusa was a lie, and that the real story was that he killed the queen of a tribe of African warrior women related to the Amazons, right? He credited that story as coming from 1st century BCE Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily. And you were no doubt left wondering if there's any historical truth to that. Especially if you're like us and can't ignore an obvious question. Moreover, you might be wondering about the whole Amazon thing in general. Were there really Amazon warrior women? If so, who were they? And if not, where did the story come from? Well, those questions aren't as simple as you might think. People have been trying to answer them since Diodorus of Sicily. Actually, people were trying to answer that question for 500 years before Diodorus of Sicily's parents were buying pottery adorned with scantily clad warrior women on them as part of one of the oldest geeky fandoms in history. And Diodorus was actually trying to tell people that the origin story of the Amazons that had become common knowledge was wrong. But to explain that, we have to explain what the common knowledge was, and is, about Amazons. The Amazons are a mythical tribe of all-female warriors. They lived in a matriarchal society which, according to most stories, completely rejected men. Depending on which stories you listen to, the Amazons would either sneak into neighboring settlements, seduce young men and get themselves pregnant, or, after they conquered a region, they would force the men to impregnate them. If an Amazon gave birth to a girl, she was raised by the Amazons as a warrior. If they gave birth to a boy, well, the nicest stories involved abandoning the child in the wilderness. The other stories were pretty cruel. The word Amazon has a number of proposed origins. One involved wearing broad belts called girdles. Another was derived from the prefix a, meaning without, and mazos, meaning breasts. And that referred to the earliest Amazon myths, which said that the Amazons would cut off and cauterize one of their breasts, which would otherwise impede their ability to draw a bow. By the way, yes, the Amazon River is named after the Amazons. In 1541, Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana's expedition was attacked by Native American women of the Incamiaba tribe. When Orellana described the fierce women to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, he dubbed the river the Amazonas after the warrior women of ancient Greek myth. The first recorded mention of the Amazons was by the Greek poet Homer in the 7th century BCE. He mentioned them in the Iliad, his account of the mythical Trojan War, an event that is also of dubious historical existence. But the war was basically part of the founding mythology of the Hellenic states of ancient Greece. According to Homer, the Amazons lived in Asia Minor, near the Black Sea. Or at least they used to do. See, the Trojan War was set at least 500 years before what Homer considered the modern day. Since that first mention and right up until today, people have been arguing over and searching for the real origin of the Amazons of myth. In these days, scholars and historians have proposed a lot of theories as to who the real Amazons might have been, or why the Greeks might have invented a matriarchal, man-hating warrior society. Many of these theories involve theories about the nature of patriarchy versus matriarchy, or involve a lot of psychosexual imagery. Half the theories claim to reveal some sort of lewd motives on the part of the ancient Greeks, while the other half reveals some pretty lewd or questionable motives on the part of the researchers putting forth the theories. And rather than editorialize and potentially reveal anything about ourselves, we're simply going to acknowledge the controversy and get back to recording the actual facts, as best we can. As it stands, except for one particularly interesting revelation which we will get to, there's no archaeological evidence of a matriarchal warrior society in Asia Minor, or Africa, or anywhere else remotely Greek adjacent. Nor is there any written evidence of such before Homer's Iliad. So, we can chalk the Amazons up to myth and leave it at that. But what's interesting is that the myth really caught on in ancient Greece, and it eventually caused a bit of a problem. See, the myths kept getting retold and expanded. Future authors expanded their role in the Trojan War. The hero Achilles fell in love with an Amazon warrior at first sight, which was a doomed romance because first sight was when her helmet fell off after Achilles had stabbed her in battle. Hercules stole a magical girdle from an Amazon queen, and so on. And because many of these myths also involved the origin story of city-states like Athens, the Amazons became inextricably linked to the foundation of, and the political identity of, Athens. What happened was this. The Hercules myth was eventually rewritten to include a mention of a pretty renowned Athenian hero named Theseus, who had helped unify the Greek states. Thus, Theseus had had run-ins with the Amazons, and the Amazons came chasing after Theseus during a mythical conflict known as the Attic War, during which Theseus helped the Athenians turn back an Amazonian siege. And that's how he became the hero of Athens. Or something. There are a lot of versions of these stories, and they are all pretty confusing. The point is, Amazons were popular images. Really popular. In fact, it became a sort of ubiquitous trope in Grecian art circa 500 BCE. The motif is called Amazonomachy, and refers to images depicting scantily clad warrior women battling Greek warriors. It really was the pop culture phenomenon of the day. But this led to a bit of a problem in ancient Greece. Greeks wanted to know where all the Amazons had gotten to, because they certainly weren't around now. So you had historians like Herodotus, who put forth theories on how the Amazons had been hiding out, living a peaceful existence in a secret capital known as Themyscira, near the Black Sea. But after the wars with the Greeks, they had been displaced and they were forced to travel north into the steppe lands of Asia Minor, where they intermingled with the people of the region like the Scythians. But Herodotus was just one of many authors who moved the Amazons. Others came before and others came after. See, as the Greeks explored more and more of the lands around them, the warrior women of their fantasies just kept not turning up where they were expected. They checked the Black Sea, for example, and found nothing. no trace. It became a sort of shell game for author historians to move the Amazons to some corner of the world the Greeks hadn't checked yet. In a weird way, Emperor Charles V was just following after a long line of Greek historians by saying, "Oh, they were probably Amazons. That's where they've been all these years, in South America, of course." So, Diodorus of Sicily was just doing more of the same in the 1st century BCE, when he argued that the Amazons weren't in Asia Minor at all. They were in Libya, in Africa. And they were at war with another tribe called the Gorgons. That's who Perseus actually killed. And also, the Atlanteans were there too, caught in the middle. Yep, he said that. Because the Greeks had also been trying to figure out where Atlantis had been and where the Atlanteans had gone to. But then, nothing. The Amazons got forgotten. Well, not forgotten, but the fandom died down a lot. And historians stopped trying to figure out where they had all gotten to. At least until the modern day, when everyone started arguing about it all over again. And then something interesting turned up. We found some warrior women in Asia Minor. In the early 1990s, a team of American and Russian archaeologists were in the steppelands south of the Ural Mountains near Kazakhstan, and they were exploring a bunch of burial sites known as kurgans that dated from the 7th century BCE. And among the 150 graves belonging to a nomadic tribe of hunters and horsefolk known as the Sarmatians, they found numerous women who had been buried with weapons, including daggers and quivers filled with bronze-tipped arrows. Many of the bodies showed signs of having been wounded or even killed in battle. The women were bow-legged from many years of riding horses, and the warrior women were unusually tall for the region and the era, averaging 5.5 feet tall. Since then, numerous other grave sites in the same region have shown similar evidence of mounted warrior women who rode into battle alongside their male counterparts. Now, it is interesting to note that the Sarmatians were one of several tribes in the region, and those tribes had settled the region as early as the 8th century BCE, and they had been unified gradually until the 6th century BCE under the Scythian Empire. And we know that because the Greek historian Herodotus wrote all about them. At least he wrote about their early days, but they were around for a long time. See, the Scythians were an expansionist empire, and they waged war with the various civilizations of the Near East as well as with Central European tribes. After their first empire fell due to various defeats, they recaptured their homelands on the shores of the Black Sea and established the Second Scythian Empire and started waging war all over again. By the 4th century BCE, they were a major military power in the region. They allied with the Greeks and began capturing slaves across the Near East to sell back to Greece. And they often provided military support to Greece. Under their greatest king, Attius, they expanded their empire to include Thrace and ended up at war with the kingdom of Macedon. And then, in 339 BCE, King Attius was killed in battle. The Scythian Empire was demoralized by the loss of Attius, and the empire began to fracture. The Thracians and Sarmatians broke away, while Celts and other outside forces attacked the kingdom's borders. Eventually, what remained of the Scythian Empire was absorbed by the Goths. It is interesting, though, that the Scythian Empire included tribes like the Sarmatians, whose warrior ranks included tall women archers and horsewomen around the time Herodotus was claiming that the mysterious Amazons had been absorbed into Scythian culture. It doesn't quite explain the origins of Homer's single-breasted warrior women, but it does give just enough of a little nudge to keep the historical scavenger hunt for the original Amazons alive. Speaking of hunting for the secret origin of Amazon women, and fandoms that border on what we shall politely call fetishistic, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about a modern Amazon myth that has enjoyed a recent surge in popularity due to a 2017 feature film that was actually pretty good if we allow ourselves a bit of editorializing now that it's safe. We're talking, of course, about Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is a comic book character published by DC Comics and created by author Charles Moulton and artist Harry G. Peter in 1941. Originally, Wonder Woman was created by Queen Hippolyta and Aphrodite and was given various special tools and powers by the Greek gods. Lately, though, her origins have changed. She's the daughter of Zeus and Hippolyta these days. And yes, that's the Hippolyta that Heracles charmed right out of her belt in that one story. Her divine gifts include a pair of indestructible bracelets, a tiara she can throw like Sailor Moon, and a lasso that forces anyone it binds to speak the truth. But none of that is what makes Wonder Woman such a well-known figure. From her early days fighting the Axis forces in World War II in the pages of All-Star Comics, Wonder Woman was recognized as something of an icon of female empowerment. Famed feminist Gloria Steinem recognized the character's influence in her Miss Magazine in 1971. And a lot has been written lately about her important role as a role woman for young geeky girls. And it has become an open secret that the creator Charles Moulton was actually a pen name belonging to psychologist William Moulton Marston. And he was inspired to create Wonder Woman as a symbol of female empowerment by his wife Elizabeth and by the couple's lover Olive Byrne. And he was also inspired by feminist leader Margaret Sanger, who was a strong early proponent of freely available birth control. But, like the Amazons who trained Wonder Woman, the origin story for the comic book character is not nearly so clear-cut. And they involved a lot of controversy and a lot of people questioning the motives of those involved. And as before, we're going to confine ourselves to presenting what facts we know, and not rendering any opinion. Back in 1942, a lot was made of the revelation that Wonder Woman's creator, Charles Moulton, was actually Dr. William Moulton Marston, psychologist and inventor of the first lie detector device. His device, by the way, relied on blood pressure detection and was an early forerunner to modern machines that involved the galvanic skin response, among other factors. But we'll save that tidbit for a future episode or as fodder for a lost episode. That revelation was nothing compared to what eventually came out from what author and historian Jill Lepore turned up as she examined Marston's and several other people's old documents and interviewed surviving members of the family and other involved parties back in 2014. Among the questions she wanted to answer was why Marston had used a pseudonym in the first place. And the whole story involves a poor comic book creator who inadvertently courted one massive controversy in his attempt to end another. As we've noted in previous episodes, comic books had gotten their start in the early 1930s. But during World War II, they gained popularity among soldiers stationed overseas. As such, they depicted adult themes including violence and sexual themes. And a controversy was brewing about what impact those so-called horrific depictions of sex and violence were having on children. Maxwell Charles Gaines, the founder of publisher All American Comics, wanted to put the argument to bed. Enter Dr. William Moulton Marston. Marston was a renowned psychologist and intellectual. He held multiple degrees, including his PhD in psychology from Harvard University. He believed in what he called an experimental life. That is, he did a little bit of everything, never allowed himself to be chained down, and he rejected conformity to social norms, though that wasn't widely known at the time. Lately, he'd been working as a consulting psychologist for Universal Pictures. And Gaines decided to hire him to serve as a consultant and an advocate for the comic industry. And so it was that in 1940, a staff writer for Family Circle magazine named Olive Richard showed up to interview Marston about the state of comics. Marston handled the interview wonderfully, and the piece helped quell some of the controversy. For a time. But the interesting thing was that Olive Richard was a pseudonym. The interviewer, who was supposed to confront Marston and take him to task, was actually named Olive Byrne. And that name had a lot of controversy attached to it. Olive Byrne was the daughter of Ethel Byrne, and Ethel Byrne was the sister of famed feminist Margaret Sanger. Sanger and Byrne had opened the first birth control clinic in the United States years prior, and had been arrested for illegal distribution of controlled substances. In jail, Byrne had nearly died due to a hunger strike. But that's not what made Olive Byrne's interview suspect. Olive Byrne was Marston's live-in lover. She had lived with Marston and his wife Elizabeth Holloway since they had met in 1925. Marston had been Burns' psychology professor. They fell in love, and Marston gave his wife, Holloway, a simple choice. Either they would all live together, or Marston would leave her. The family lived together, claiming that Byrne was Holloway's widowed sister-in-law. Marston fathered 2 children by each of the women. Byrne raised the children while Holloway pursued her career. In lieu of a wedding ring, Byrne wore a pair of bracers, the same bracers that Wonder Woman would be depicted with. And they staged the interview. And Gaines had no idea. Gaines was impressed by how well the interview had gone. He appointed Marston as part of an editorial board to oversee content at All Star Comics. And eventually, Marston proposed his own comic. He wanted to depict, in his words, psychological propaganda for the new type of woman who, I believe, should rule the world. He described her as a warrior who had left paradise to fight fascism with feminism in America, the last citadel of democracy and of equal rights for women. But Marston was still keeping his own life shrouded in secrecy. He knew that he would face fierce prejudice for his family situation, and he did not want any direct connection between his lover and Margaret Sanger to come to the public's awareness, because he knew the controversy could destroy his quest to spread his message. Unfortunately, the comic did start facing controversy almost immediately. Various groups objected to the over-sexualized depiction of Wonder Woman. She was scantily clad, they complained, and fetishistic. And she spent a lot of time being tied up and bound by men, to the point where Wonder Woman herself lamented being tired of being tied up various times in the pages of her comic. Marston claimed the depiction was empowering because Wonder Woman always freed herself. Others weren't so sure. The uncredited artist who created Wonder Woman expressed some concern repeatedly over the extreme and almost sexual detail with which Marston described the bondage scenes that he would have to draw. The question troubled Gaines and others. And when objections started to come to the fore, Marston dug in his heels to defend the frequent depictions of bondage. He claimed as a psychologist that women enjoy and fantasize about submission and bondage. When the magazine started getting letters from men and women seeking advice about bondage from Marston, and this was after his identity as the comic's creator was revealed, Gaines tried to push Marston to lighten up. And he refused, claiming the eroticism was healthy and he was happy to inspire it. Gaines wanted to distance himself from the controversy, which was now growing more than ever. So much so that when Wonder Woman was offered the chance to become a weekly newspaper comic, Gaines asked another author to write it. Meanwhile, Marston was ousted from the editorial board at All American Comics. When Marston died in 1947, he'd taken many secrets to his grave that were revealed in his private papers. He'd claimed his wife, Holloway, had been the primary inspiration for Wonder Woman, concealed the nature of his relationship with Olive Byrne, and hidden her relationship to Margaret Sanger. Meanwhile, we know that the comics industry eventually ended up sanitized through the self-censoring comics code of the 50s. And fans and psychologists and social activists of every stripe have continued to argue Wonder Woman's value as an empowering feminist icon or an overly sexualized object of fetishistic lust. Of course, the truth is, these stories have been retold and re-examined and changed too many times since their secret origins for us to ever be sure of the true inspirations and motives behind their creation. This has been GM Word of the Week. It's written and researched by The Angry GM and produced by me, Fiddleback. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GM Word of the Week. You can find more at gmwordoftheweek.com and theangrygm.com.